The morning sun cast long shadows across the town square, but Margaret felt nothing but cold dread as she stood on the wooden platform. Her bare feet were numb against the rough planks, and her simple gray dress hung loose on her thin frame. Just 3 months ago, she had been wearing silk gowns and worrying about nothing more serious than which book to read next. Now, at 19 years old, she was about to be sold like a piece of furniture to pay off her father's debts. The auctioneer, a portly man with a booming voice, was getting ready to start the bidding. Margaret could see him shuffling through his papers, preparing to announce her like she was cattle at market. Her heart pounded so hard she thought everyone could hear it. She wanted to run, but where could she go? 2 guards stood at the edges of the platform, making sure she stayed put. Below her, a crowd had gathered. Men in expensive coats whispered to each other, sizing her up like they were buying a horse. She caught pieces of their conversations that made her stomach turn. One man was discussing whether she looked strong enough for field work. Another was wondering if she could cook and clean properly. A third was making crude jokes about pretty servants that made her want to disappear into the ground. Margaret had never imagined her life would come to this. Her father had been a respected merchant in their small town, trading in fine goods and keeping a comfortable home. She had grown up with books, music lessons, and dreams of maybe becoming a teacher someday. Her mother had died when she was 12, but her father had made sure she continued her education. He had always told her that knowledge was the one thing. No one could take away from her. How wrong he had been. When her father died suddenly of a heart attack 6 months ago, Margaret discovered the terrible truth. His business was drowning in debt. He had been borrowing money to keep up appearances, taking loans from dangerous people who didn't care about his grieving daughter. The fine house, the servants, the comfortable life, it had all been built on borrowed time and borrowed money. The creditors came like vultures. They took the house, the furniture, even her mother's jewelry. They went through every room, making lists of what could be sold. Margaret watched helplessly as strangers carried away her childhood, piece by piece. Her father's books, her mother's piano, the family portraits, everything that made their house a home was loaded into wagons and taken away, but even selling everything wasn't enough. The debts were too large, and the creditors wanted their money. That's when they told her about the law that allowed them to sell her into indentured servitude. 7 years of her life would pay off what was owed. 7 years of working for whoever bought her, doing whatever they demanded, living however they decided. Margaret had tried to fight it. She went to the local magistrate, pleading for mercy, but he just shrugged and told her it was better than debtor's prison. She wrote letters to distant relatives, begging for help, but got no replies. She even tried to find work on her own, thinking maybe she could earn enough to pay the debts, but no one would hire a young woman with no references and no connections. The weeks leading up to the auction had been the worst of her life. She had been forced to stay in a boarding house with other people awaiting sale, sleeping on a thin mattress in a room she shared with 3 other women. The food was terrible, and she had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. The other women told her horror stories about their buyers, men who worked their servants from dawn to dusk, fed them scraps, and treated them worse than animals. Some nights, Margaret lay awake wondering if she should try to run away. But where would she go? She had no money, no friends, and no family. The law would find her and bring her back, probably making her situation even worse. At least this way, she told herself, she would survive. 7 years seemed like forever, but eventually she would be free again. The worst part was how the townspeople looked at her now. People who had once smiled and nodded respectfully when she walked by with her father now crossed the street to avoid her. Some whispered behind her back, spreading rumors about why her father had really died and whether she had known about the debts. Others looked at her with pity that felt almost as bad as the cruelty. Margaret had always been proud of her education, her manners, and her family's good name. Now she felt like all of that had been stripped away. She was just another piece of property to be bought and sold, no different from a plow or a cow. The auctioneer didn't care that she could read Latin or that she had once dreamed of teaching children. All that mattered was whether she could work hard enough to earn back the money her father owed. As the morning wore on, more people arrived in the square. Margaret recognized some of them: the baker who had once given her free cookies when she was a child, the blacksmith who had fixed her father's wagon, the minister who had preached at her father's funeral. None of them looked at her now. They were all focused on other things, pretending not to notice the girl on the platform who had once been their neighbor. The auctioneer was getting ready to start. He cleared his throat and began reading from his papers, listing Margaret's age, her health, and her skills. He mentioned that she could read and write, which brought interested murmurs from some of the men below. Literacy was rare, especially among servants, and it made her more valuable. Margaret felt sick as the bidding began. The auctioneer started low, but the numbers climbed quickly. Men shouted out offers like they were buying grain at market. She tried to see their faces, to guess what kind of masters they might be, but most were strangers to her. Some looked kind enough, but others had cold eyes that frightened her. One man in particular worried her. He was well-dressed but had a cruel smile as he bid. She had heard whispers about him, stories of servants who had worked for him and been found beaten or worse. When his bid was accepted, Margaret felt her knees shake. But then another voice called out a higher offer, and the bidding continued. The sun climbed higher, and Margaret's throat grew dry. She wanted water, but nobody offered her any. She was just merchandise, after all. The crowd grew restless as the bidding went on, some people leaving to attend to their own business. But the serious buyers remained, determined to get their monies worth. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to remember better times. Sunday dinners with her father, reading by the fireplace on winter evenings, helping her mother tend their small garden. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else. Now, a different girl who had lived a different life. That girl had been naive and sheltered, unaware of how quickly everything could change. When she opened her eyes again, the bidding had reached a price that made her feel dizzy. She was worth more than some people's houses, more than a good horse, or a year's worth of grain. It should have made her feel valuable, but instead it just reminded her that she was being sold like property. The amount didn't matter to her, whether she went for a high price or a low one. She would still be a slave for the next 7 years. The auctioneer was getting excited now, his voice getting louder as the bids climbed higher. Margaret could see the sweat on his forehead despite the cool morning air. This was a good day for him. He got a percentage of every sale, and she was bringing in more money than he had probably expected. As the bidding reached its peak, Margaret found herself holding her breath, waiting to learn her fate. Thomas had never planned to be at the auction that day. He had come to town for supplies, nothing more. His wagon was already loaded with flour, salt, and other necessities for the coming winter. All he wanted was to get back to his farm before dark, where his 2 young children were waiting with their grandmother. But as he walked past the town square, something made him stop. The crowd around the platform caught his attention first. There were too many people gathered for an ordinary market day, and their voices carried a different tone than usual. Thomas was a quiet man who minded his own business, but curiosity got the better of him. He pushed through the crowd to see what was happening, and his heart sank when he realized what kind of auction this was. A young woman stood on the wooden platform, and Thomas could see the fear in her eyes from where he stood. She was trying to look brave, but her hands were shaking. She reminded him of his sister Catherine, who had died young from the fever. Catherine had been about the same age, with that same look of quiet dignity even when the world seemed to be falling apart around her. Thomas had heard about these auctions, but he had never seen one before. The whole thing felt wrong to him. He was a simple farmer, not an educated man, but he knew right from wrong. Seeing a young woman being sold like livestock made his stomach turn. He started to walk away, telling himself it wasn't his business. But something kept him rooted to the spot. The auctioneer was calling out bids, and Thomas watched in horror as men shouted out prices like they were buying cattle. Some of the bidders made crude comments about the girl, and Thomas felt his anger rising. His late wife Mary would have been furious if she could see this. She had always believed that every person deserved to be treated with respect, no matter their station in Thomas had been alone for almost a year now, ever since Mary died from the fever that swept through their county. She had been helping nurse the sick, despite his pleas for her to stay home and stay safe. That was just like Mary, always putting others before herself. The fever took her in 3 days, leaving Thomas to raise their 2 children alone, 8-year-old. Lucy and 6-year-old Peter had been struggling without their mother. Thomas did his best, but he was often overwhelmed trying to manage the farm and care for 2 grieving children. His mother-in-law helped when she could, but she was getting old and couldn't do as much as she used to. The children needed a woman's care, but Thomas had no idea how to provide that for them. He had been so focused on just getting through each day that he hadn't thought much about the future. His farm was doing well enough to feed his family, but there wasn't much left over. He had saved a little money for winter supplies and emergencies, but not enough to live comfortably. Every penny had to be stretched as far as it would go. As the bidding continued, Thomas found himself studying the faces of the men calling out prices. He recognized some of them from around town, and what he saw made him uncomfortable. There was William Patterson, who was known for working his hired hands from dawn to dusk with barely enough food to keep them alive. There was James Morrison, whose last 3 servants had all run away within a year, though no one talked about why. The highest bidder at the moment was Robert Claiborne, a wealthy merchant who had a reputation for cruelty. Thomas had heard stories about Claiborne's household: servants who disappeared without explanation, young women who were never seen in town again. The thought of this innocent girl ending up in that man's hands made Thomas feel sick. He looked at the girl again, and something in her expression reminded him not just of his sister, but of his own children. What if Lucy or Peter were ever in such a desperate situation? What if they needed someone to help them, and everyone just walked away? The thought made his chest tighten with emotion he wasn't prepared for. Thomas was not a wealthy man, but he was not poor either. His farm produced enough to support his family, and Mary had been careful with money. They had always lived simply, saving what they could for hard times. He had about $50 in his pocket, money he had planned to use for winter supplies and maybe a small gift for each of his children. The bidding was getting more intense now. Claiborne was determined to win, and his bids were climbing higher and higher. Thomas could see the satisfaction in the man's eyes, and it made him angry. This wasn't about needing help on a farm or in a household. This was about power and control, about owning another human being without really thinking about what he was doing. Thomas raised his hand and called out a bid. It was more than he had ever spent on anything except his farm, but the words came out before he could stop them. The crowd turned to look at him, surprised to see a simple farmer challenging the wealthy merchants. Claiborne's face darkened when he saw Thomas bidding against him. He immediately raised his offer, clearly annoyed that anyone would dare compete with him. Thomas felt his heart racing, but he bid again, using money he didn't really have. He was already calculating in his head. He would have to sell some of his livestock to cover the cost, and winter would be lean for his family. The other bidders began to drop out as the price climbed higher than they were willing to pay. Soon it was just Thomas and Claiborne, facing off across the crowded square. Thomas could feel the sweat on his forehead despite the cool air. He was not a man who enjoyed being the center of attention, but he couldn't back down now. He thought about his children at home, probably playing in the yard while their grandmother watched from the porch. They needed so many things: new shoes, warmer clothes for winter, books to help with their learning. The money he was bidding could have provided all of that and more. But every time he looked at the girl on the platform, he knew he couldn't walk away. Claiborne bid again, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. Thomas could see the man's anger building, and he knew he was making a dangerous enemy. Claiborne was the kind of man who remembered slights and found ways to get revenge. But Thomas had gone too far to stop now. The girl was looking at him now, and he could see confusion in her eyes. She didn't understand why a stranger would be fighting for her, especially against someone with Claiborne's reputation and wealth. Thomas wasn't sure he understood it himself. All he knew was that he couldn't stand by and watch something terrible happen when he had the power to stop it. His final bid used every cent he had saved, plus money he would have to borrow against his next harvest. It was more than he had ever spent on anything, more than some people made in a year. The crowd fell silent as they waited to see if Claiborne would respond. For a long moment, the wealthy merchant glared at Thomas with pure hatred in his eyes. Then, with a disgusted snort, he turned and stalked away from the auction. He had been willing to pay a lot for the girl, but not enough to bankrupt himself out of spite. The auctioneer's hammer fell, and suddenly Thomas owned another human being. The reality of what he had done hit him like a physical blow. He had just changed the course of two lives, hers and his own, without really understanding what would come next. The wagon ride to Thomas's farm was the longest hour of Margaret's life. She sat in the back, clutching her small bundle of belongings, while Thomas drove in complete silence. She had no idea what to expect from this man who had just paid a fortune for her. Was he kind or cruel? Would he work her to death in his fields, or did he have other plans for her that she didn't want to think about? Margaret stole glances at Thomas as they traveled down the dusty road. He was older than she had first thought, probably in his mid-30s, with weathered hands and the kind of tan that came from working outside all day. His clothes were simple but clean, and his wagon, though old, was well maintained. He didn't look like the wealthy merchants who had been bidding on her, but he had somehow outbid them all. She wanted to ask him questions, but fear kept her silent. What if he was the kind of man who didn't like servants to speak unless spoken to? What if her first words to him made him angry? She had heard too many stories about masters who punished their servants for the smallest mistakes. So she sat quietly, watching the countryside pass by and wondering what her new life would be like. The farm, when they finally reached it, was not what Margaret had expected. It was modest but well kept, with a small wooden house surrounded by fields of corn and wheat. There was a vegetable garden near the house, and she could see chickens pecking around the yard. It looked like the kind of place where a family might live happily. Not like the harsh work camps she had heard about. As the wagon stopped, Margaret heard the sound of children's voices. Two young ones came running out of the house, followed by an older woman who was wiping her hands on her apron. The children stopped short when they saw Margaret, their eyes wide with curiosity. The woman, their grandmother, Margaret guessed, looked confused and a little worried. "Papa, who is this?" asked the little girl. She was maybe 8 years old, with brown hair tied back in braids and dirt on her dress from playing outside. The boy was younger, perhaps 6, and he stayed close to his sister as he stared at Margaret. Thomas climbed down from the wagon and helped Margaret to the ground. His touch was gentle, which surprised her. Most of the men at the auction had looked at her like she was a thing to be used, but Thomas treated her like a person who deserved respect. "Children, this is Margaret," Thomas said, his voice kind but serious. "She's going to be staying with us for a while." He looked at the older woman. "Mother Grace, could you help her get settled? She be taking care of the household." The woman Thomas called Mother Grace looked at Margaret with sharp but not unkind eyes. "Come inside, child," she said. "You look like you haven't had a proper meal in weeks." Margaret followed them into the house, still not sure what to make of her situation. The inside was simple but comfortable, with handmade furniture and quilts that showed a woman's touch. There were toys scattered on the floor and books on a shelf by the fireplace. It felt like a real home, not like the cold places she had imagined. "Sit down," Mother Grace said, pointing to a chair at the kitchen table. "I'll get you something to eat." Margaret sat carefully, still expecting someone to tell her she wasn't allowed to use the good furniture. But Thomas pulled out a chair across from her and sat down too, as if she were a guest instead of a servant he had just bought. "I suppose you're wondering why I bought your contract," Thomas said, his voice gentle. Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak yet. "I lost my wife last year to the fever. The children need a woman's care, and I need help keeping the house. But I want you to know that you'll be treated fairly here. You'll eat with the family and you'll have your own room. I'm not the kind of man who mistreats people under his roof." Margaret felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She had been prepared for the worst, and this kindness was almost harder to handle than cruelty would have been. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. "You don't have to call me sir," Thomas said. "Thomas is fine." "And these are my children, Lucy." "And Peter. They're good kids, but they've been struggling since their mother died. I'm hoping you can help them, and maybe they can help you too." Over the next few days, Margaret began to understand her new situation. Thomas was nothing like the cruel masters she had feared. He worked hard on his farm, rising before dawn and working until dark, but he never demanded that she do more than she was able. Her duties were mainly caring for the children and keeping the house, tasks that felt more like helping a family than serving a master. The children were grieving their mother, and Margaret's heart went out to them. Lucy tried to be strong and take care of her little brother, but Margaret could see the sadness in her eyes. Peter was quieter, often clinging to his grandmother or his father when he thought no one was looking. They needed love and attention, things Margaret found herself wanting to give them. Margaret had always been good with children. Before her father died, she had sometimes helped teach the younger children at their church, and she had enjoyed it. Now she found herself naturally falling into the role of caring for Lucy and Peter. She helped them with their washing, mended their clothes, and began teaching them their letters in the evenings. One night, as she was tucking Peter into bed, he looked up at her with serious eyes. "Are you going to stay with us forever?" he asked. Margaret's heart broke a little. "I'm going to stay for a long time," she said, not knowing how to explain the complicated legal situation to a 6-year-old. "Don't worry about that. Just focus on growing big and strong." Thomas was often around the house, and Margaret began to see what kind of man he really was. He was patient with his children, gentle with the animals, and respectful to everyone he met. He never raised his voice or lost his temper, even when things went wrong. He was the kind of man her father had been. Before the debts and the worry had changed him in the evenings. After the children were in bed, Thomas would often sit by the fireplace reading. Margaret was surprised to discover that he had several books, more than she would have expected from a simple farmer. One night she gathered the courage to ask him about them. "My wife loved to read," Thomas explained, his voice soft with memory. "She taught me to enjoy books too. She always said that reading was like traveling to places you could never go in real life." Margaret felt a flutter of hope. "I love to read too," she said quietly. "My father made sure I had a good education before he died." Thomas looked at her with interest. "Really? What kind of books do you like?" For the first time since her father's death, Margaret found herself talking about something she enjoyed. They discussed books and ideas, and she was amazed to discover that Thomas was much more educated than she had assumed. He had opinions about literature and philosophy that showed he was a thoughtful, intelligent man. As the weeks passed, Margaret began to feel something she hadn't expected. She was starting to feel at home. The children were warming up to her, the work was manageable, and Thomas continued to treat her with respect and kindness. She still carried the legal weight of being an indentured servant, but day by day it felt less like a burden and more like she was simply part of a family that needed her as much as she needed them. Spring came early that year, bringing with it changes that Margaret had never expected. She had been living with Thomas and his family for 6 months now, and what had started as a desperate situation had slowly transformed into something that felt like home. The children had grown attached to her, and she had found herself caring for them in ways that went far beyond her duties as a servant. Lucy was now reading simple books on her own, thanks to Margaret's patient teaching. Every evening she would curl up next to Margaret by the fireplace and read aloud, her small voice growing more confident with each passing day. Peter had overcome his shyness and now followed Margaret around the house, chattering about everything he saw and learned. He had started calling her Miss Margaret in a way that made her heart warm, but it was Thomas who surprised her most. What had begun as polite conversation had deepened into something Margaret had never experienced before. In the evenings, after the children were asleep, they would sit together and talk about everything under the sun. Thomas would tell her about his dreams for the farm, his worries about raising his children alone, and his memories of his late wife. Margaret found herself sharing her own thoughts and feelings in return, something she had never done with any Man, before, Thomas had a way of listening that made her feel like her opinions mattered. When she suggested improvements to the vegetable garden, he took her advice seriously. When she offered to help with the farm's bookkeeping, he was grateful for her education and skill with numbers. He treated her like a partner rather than a servant, and Margaret found herself falling in love with this kind, gentle man. The problem was that she was still legally bound to him as an indentured servant. No matter how much he respected her or how much she cared for his family, the law said she belonged to him for another 6.5 years. The thought of being in love with a man who technically owned her made her feel confused and ashamed. Thomas seemed to be struggling with the same feelings. Margaret caught him looking at her sometimes with an expression she couldn't quite read. When their hands accidentally touched while working together, he would pull away quickly as if he had been burned. There was something growing between them, but neither of them knew how to handle it. The situation became more complicated when the neighbors started talking. Margaret had been doing the shopping in town for months, and she had noticed the way people looked at her and whispered behind her back. At first she thought they were just gossiping about her past, but gradually she realized they were talking about her relationship with Thomas. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store, made pointed comments about how well-dressed Margaret looked and how comfortable she seemed. "Some servants sure do live better than others," she said one day, loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "Must be nice to have such a generous master." The comments stung because Margaret knew what they were implying. People thought she was getting special treatment because she was sharing Thomas's bed, which couldn't have been further from the truth. Thomas had never so much as touched her inappropriately, but the gossips didn't care about facts. Things got worse when Thomas's late wife's family came to visit. His mother-in-law, Mrs. Morrison, had always been cold toward Margaret, but now she was openly hostile. She spent her visit watching Margaret's every move and making sharp comments about servants who forgot their place. The breaking point came when Mrs. Morrison pulled Thomas aside for a private conversation. Margaret couldn't hear what they said, but she could see the tension in Thomas's face when they finished talking. That evening he was distant and quiet, barely speaking to her at all. Later, Margaret learned what had happened from Mother Grace, who had overheard the conversation. Mrs. Morrison had accused Thomas of having an improper relationship with his servant. She threatened to report him to the authorities and take the children away if he didn't get rid of Margaret immediately. She said it wasn't right for the children to be raised by a woman of questionable character. Mother Grace explained, her voice heavy with disapproval, as if that sweet girl could be anything but good for those babies. Margaret felt her world crashing down around her. She had finally found a place where she belonged, people who cared about her, and now it was all going to be taken away because of malicious gossip. She knew that Thomas would never risk losing his children, and she wouldn't want him to. But the thought of leaving this family that had become everything to her was almost unbearable. The next morning, Margaret made a decision that broke her heart. She went to Thomas and told him she thought it would be best if he found her a new position somewhere else. She tried to keep her voice steady, as she explained that she didn't want to cause trouble for him and the children. Thomas looked at her with such pain in his eyes that she almost changed her mind. "Is that what you want?" he asked quietly. "To leave us?" Margaret wanted to tell him the truth. That leaving was the last thing she wanted, that she had fallen in love with him and his children, that this farm had become the only home she had ever truly known. But she knew that admitting her feelings would only make things worse for everyone. "I think it's for the best," she said instead, hating herself for the lie, but Thomas wasn't willing to give up so easily. That evening he asked her to walk with him to the far edge of his property, where they could talk without being overheard. The spring air was warm and wildflowers were blooming in the fields around them. "I need to tell you something," Thomas said, his voice serious. "I've been thinking about this for weeks, and I can't keep it to myself anymore. I care about you, Margaret. More than I should, more than is proper. I know I have no right to feel this way, given our situation, but I can't help it." Margaret felt her heart racing. "Thomas, you don't understand. People are talking. Your mother-in-law thinks. I don't care what people think. Thomas interrupted, something he had never done before. I care about what's right, and what's right is treating you the way you deserve to be treated. Not as a servant, not as property, but as the remarkable woman you are. He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. I want to find a way to end your indenture. I want to give you your freedom, and then I want to ask you to stay with us. Anyway, not because you have to, but because you want to. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. Even if that were possible, the scandal would ruin you. People would never accept it. Then maybe it's time for me to stop caring what people accept, Thomas said. My wife used to say that the only opinion that mattered was your own conscience. My conscience tells me that what I feel for you is good and right, even if the world doesn't understand it. As they stood there in the fading light, Margaret realized that Thomas was willing to risk everything for her. His reputation, his standing in the community, maybe even his children's future. The question was whether she was brave enough to let him. The weeks that followed Thomas's confession were the most difficult of Margaret's life. She wanted to believe that love could conquer everything, but the harsh reality of their situation kept pulling her back to earth. Every day brought new reminders of the obstacles they faced. The whispers in town grew louder, and even some of Thomas's longtime friends began treating him differently. Margaret watched as Thomas struggled with the weight of his decision. He had always been a man who cared about doing the right thing, but now he was caught between his feelings for her and his responsibility to his children. She could see the stress wearing on him, the way he would stare out at his fields late. At night, lost in thought, the breaking point came when Robert Claiborne, the cruel merchant who had tried to buy Margaret at the auction, showed up at their farm one evening. Margaret was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard his voice. Outside, her blood ran cold as she remembered the stories she had heard about him and the servants who had disappeared. I hear you're having some troubles with your household help, Claiborne said to Thomas, his voice carrying through the open window. I might be willing to take that burden off your hands. For the right price, of course. Margaret crept closer to the window to listen. Thomas's voice was steady but cold when he replied, Margaret is not for sale. Everything is for sale, friend. Claiborne laughed. Especially when a man's reputation is at stake. I hear the good people of this town are starting to question your judgment. Wouldn't want that to affect your children's future, would you? Get off my land, Thomas said, his voice harder than Margaret had ever heard it. Think about my offer. Claiborne called as he walked away. I'll pay double what you spent on her. Might be your last chance to get out of this mess with some dignity intact. That night, Margaret made her decision. She couldn't let Thomas destroy his life for her sake. While the family slept, she packed her few belongings and prepared to leave. She would walk to the next town and find work somewhere, somehow. It would break her heart to leave the children, but it was better than watching Thomas lose everything. Because of her. She was almost out the door when she heard footsteps behind her. Thomas stood in the hallway, still in his nightclothes, looking at her packed bag. Were you really going to leave without saying goodbye? He asked softly. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. I can't let you sacrifice everything for me. Your children need stability. They need a father who isn't fighting scandal and gossip every day. Thomas stepped closer to her. Do you know what my children need most? They need someone who loves them the way you do. They need the woman who taught Lucy to read and helped Peter overcome his nightmares. They need you, Margaret. But the town will never accept it, Margaret sobbed. People like Claiborne will never leave us alone. Thomas took her hands in his. Then maybe we need to change the game entirely. The next morning, Thomas hitched up his wagon and asked Margaret to come with him to town. She was confused but trusted him enough to agree. Instead of going to the general store or the bank as she expected, he drove straight to the office of Judge Williams, the man who handled legal matters for their county. Judge Williams was an old friend of Thomas's father, and had known Thomas since he was a boy. He listened carefully as Thomas explained what he wanted to do. Margaret sat quietly, hardly daring to breathe as she realized what Thomas was proposing. I want to purchase the remainder of Margaret's indenture contract, Thomas said. All of It, right now, and then I want to tear it up and set her free." The judge raised his eyebrows. "That's a lot of money, son." "Are you sure about this?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Thomas replied. Margaret watched in amazement as Thomas counted out a sum that represented years of careful saving. It was money he had been setting aside for his children's future, for improvements. To the farm, for emergencies. He was spending all of it to buy her freedom. When the paperwork was complete, Judge Williams handed Margaret the contract. "You're free to do whatever you want now, young lady. No one owns you anymore." Margaret held the papers with shaking hands. After more than a year of being someone else's property, she was finally free. But Thomas wasn't finished. "There's one more thing I'd like to ask the judge," Thomas said, turning to Margaret with a nervous smile. "Margaret, I know I'm not. I'm just a simple farmer with 2 children and more dreams than money. But I love you, and I think you might love me too. Will you marry me?" Margaret's heart stopped. She looked at this man who had just given her the most precious gift imaginable, her freedom, and was now asking her to choose to stay with him forever. "But Thomas, what about the scandal? What about what people will say?" Thomas took her hands again. "People will always find something to talk about. But the people who really matter, the ones who know us and care about us, they'll understand. And the ones who don't understand? Well, maybe their opinion isn't worth worrying about." Judge Williams cleared his throat. "If you're asking me to perform a marriage ceremony, I'd be honored to do it. I've known this young man his whole life, and I've never seen him happier than he's been these past few months." Margaret looked into Thomas's eyes and saw all the love and hope and courage that had brought them to this moment. She thought about Lucy and Peter, who had become like her own children. She thought about the farm that had become her home, the life they could build together. "Yes," she whispered, and then louder, "Yes, I'll marry you." The wedding was small and simple, held right there in the judge's office with Mother Grace and the children as witnesses. Margaret wore the same simple dress she had worn the day Thomas bought her freedom, but she had never felt more beautiful. When Thomas kissed her as his wife, she knew that this was what true freedom felt like, not just being free from chains, but being free to choose love. The years that followed weren't always easy. Some people in town never fully accepted their marriage, and there were times when money was tight. But Thomas and Margaret built a life together based on love, respect, and shared dreams. They expanded the farm, raised Thomas's children as their own, and eventually had children of their own. Margaret never forgot where she came from or how close she had come to a very different fate. When she heard about other young people in desperate situations, she and Thomas always found ways to help. They opened their home to those who needed shelter and used their resources to help others gain their freedom. Years later, Margaret would establish a small school in their town, teaching children whose families couldn't afford proper education. She never forgot the power of knowledge and the importance of giving everyone a chance to better themselves. The farmer who had saved her from the auction block had given her more than just freedom from servitude. He had shown her what love looked like when it was built on respect and kindness. Together, they had proven that sometimes the greatest acts of courage come not from fighting against the world, but from choosing to build something better within it. Their love story became legend in their small town, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, hope and human kindness can change everything.